However, it is something that we try to do every year, to look at the seven realities of experiencing God, because it's kind of our foundation for what we do in ministry, is learning to experience God, learning to be a lighthouse in a dark world. And so, one of the things that we often act as is if God tells us what he wants us to do, and then we off on our own, and we don't, and God doesn't, and God just kind of abandons us. And then we think, okay, anytime we need him, we can call on him and he'll help us, but otherwise we're basically on our own. It's almost like, God's waiting, but he's too busy to help us all the time. So we tend to think we have to do it on our own. And especially when it comes to doing his will, you know, we really struggle with thinking that we have to do all this on our own, that we live our life and we are basically on our own. So, but that's not the biblical picture of how God works in our lives. And when God is about to do something in our lives or through our lives, he has to get us from where we are to where he is. And in doing so, he takes the initiative to draw us toward him so that we might hear his voice and understand what he's doing and what he invites us to do by way of obedience to join him in his work. But the one thing we must know, if you take nothing else out of here, if you decide I'm taking a nap from after my service and I'm just going to sleep, I want you to wake up long enough to listen to this one statement. We cannot stay where we are and go with God. You got that? We cannot stay where we are and go with God. To follow God's direction will always make a difference in my life, in your life. Today, I want us to think about the spiritual dynamics associated with discovering and getting in God's will. Now, there was a 36-year-old unmarried woman came to her pastor with a very stressful dilemma. She said, "Pastor, to put it easily, I'm tired of being single. I want to be married. I'm approaching 40, and I think it's time." The understanding pastor tried to exercise wisdom in consoling the anxious single. He reminded her that God had a perfect plan for her life, and she could not improve on the will of God. She responded to his discourse on God's plan by saying, "Pastor, I'm not trying to improve on it. I just want to get in on it." Because we cannot improve God's will, we should want to make sure we get in on it. There are 7 realities by which we can be led in God's will and experience him in our own lives. Today, as we consider the story of Moses and how he committed himself to following the call of God, I want us to take note of those 7 realities, because we're going to be looking at Exodus 2:22 through 4 verse 20, or chapter 4 verse 20. Now, I did not write it all out because it's quite a large passage. So if you don't have your Bible with you, you may need to write these notes down and look them up and read them later. But there's something I need you to understand as we begin all this. God is already at work. He was already working around Moses. He's already working our lives. He's already working this church. He was at work in this church before it ever founded. Exodus 2:23 through 25 says this: "Now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died. The children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. So God remembered their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them." You see, God was already at work. Moses didn't realize it. God was aware of the needs of the people, and God had been at work bringing about their deliverance. God is always at work about his redemptive work. He's always at work to accomplish his purpose of drawing people unto himself, and will bring glory and honor to him. He's always moving and always and working. And just because we don't see it, just because we don't necessarily recognize the hand of God, doesn't mean he isn't at work in the world. For centuries, Israel looked for the coming of the Messiah. They wondered when the Messiah would come and why he had not yet arrived. And then they had Malachi, and Malachi said that, was the last prophet, and 400 years of silence followed. And during those 400 years, the Israelites began to doubt whether there was a Messiah coming or whether God was really involved. But God was in the process of working out his redemptive history. Where was he? Well, he was at work. He was orchestrating world events, raising up people who would obey, maneuvering circumstances so the Messiah could come and accomplish the work upon redemption. Then Paul tells us in Galatians 4:4 that when the time had fully come, God sent his son. Had God been doing nothing to bring about world redemption prior to our Lord's arrival on earth? Of course not. He'd been at work all along, and that's what Jesus was saying in John 5:17. In the same way, God had been at work to set the stage for what he was calling Moses to be a part of. And God set the stage to plant Grace Baptist Church of Second Life in Second Life. God is at work in Second Life. Yes, I know it doesn't seem like it sometimes. You look around, you see how quiet it is, you see so much of the garbage that goes on in Second Life, and you think, how can God be at work here? How could he possibly? He barely has a presence, but God is at work. God is preparing. Years ago, when I was the student ministry pastor at Del Rio Community Church, we were really struggling. We had been planted by a mother church who really didn't give much thought to the plant, and started it with 8 people who they loaned us to start the church with, and they called my pastor as pastor, and I ended up there as the youth pastor, student ministry, discipleship, whatever, you name it. I did a little bit of everything. It's what happens when you're in a small church. And as soon as we got established, those 8 people went back to the mother church. So it was basically, that we went from 8 to 16 back to 8, all within about 6 months of starting the church. And the church struggled. It would grow for a little while, and then it would hit a wall, and we'd fall back. Part of it was that they had built the building. They built the building, basically was a glorified house, and its max capacity was about 110 people, and we get to about 75 or 80, and people would start leaving because it got crowded, and it was too busy, and too much traffic, and that's the reality of, the building was not designed to grow. But more than that, it was like, we just didn't get it. Why Port St. Lucie, Western Port St. Lucie, was so cold to the gospel. And then one Sunday morning, we're in prayer and preparing for service, and I hear this still small voice in the back of my head. Pray for the harvest. And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, God, you know there's 12 people here, right? What kind of harvest are we going to have with 12 people? And still, pray for the harvest. Okay. So I began to pray for the harvest. And every week I'd pray for the harvest. And nothing happened. There was no harvest. The same 12 people kept coming. 6 months came, still praying for what God told me to pray for, begging him to send workers for the harvest. What harvest I didn't see yet. In the meantime, financially, the church was hurting. We had a $12,000 a month mortgage and a total of 22 people. Take my word for it, folks. If everybody tithes, that doesn't cover the bills. That doesn't begin to cover everything. Finally,